Hello, the topic of my blog post today is to provide an overview of an article written by Patrick Overeem entitled The Value of the Dichotomy, Politics, Administration, and the Political Neutrality of Administrators. This article appeared in the Administrative Theory and Praxis publication, which was published in June 2005, Volume 27, Issue 2. And this will build off of my previous blog post that provided an overview of the literature review section of this same article. Omnivorous vegetarianism, which is just a great phrase, again, in my opinion, which I pointed out in my previous post. The author argues that you cannot remove the politics from a public administration role, although the public administrator should strive for political neutrality, and arguing the aforementioned statement presents a paradox, like an omnivore defending vegetarianism. So therefore, the author states it's necessary to understand the concept of political neutrality, discuss the evolution of the public administration theory experts' thought processes, emphasize the differences in the evolution of how policy and politics are defined, and conclude that the dichotomy is due for a rehabilitation. The concept of political neutrality. Political neutrality, defined simply, refers to the impartiality of public administrators. There are 6 key principles provided in the text, but the one that is specific to the author's argument states, politics and policy are separated from administration. Thus, politicians make policy decisions, and public servants execute these decisions. And the aforementioned principle's relation to political neutrality is the basis of this article. There was another principle that mentions that public servants do not engage in partisan political activities, and we'll also get more into that later. The author argues the idea that public servants cannot be politically indifferent is not realistic, although they should be politically neutral as much as possible. And a better understanding of dominant thought processes and how partisanship relates to how politics versus policy is defined is necessary to thoroughly understand the conceptual relationship between the politics administration dichotomy and political neutrality in public administrators. Classical conceptualizations. There were different schools of thought in the early 20th century from American and European traditions regarding the dichotomy. Now, the classic American-based beliefs were that politics had much too strong an influence on public administrators, and the European beliefs, however, were politics weren't strong enough to balance the power of the administrators. So while these conclusions clashed, nonetheless they both agreed in the dichotomy and the necessity of political neutrality, and therefore they concluded it's the partisan politics that need to be removed from public administration so the administrator can execute their duties with impartiality. And so another way to say this is that administrators should exhibit neutral competence. So in other words, they should not be guided by personal or party obligations, but they should be guided by explicit, objective standards. The reconceptualization of the dichotomy. So the criticism of this increased as the 20th century advanced, as numerous movements like the New Public Administration, for example, appeared. The concept of politics versus policy really kind of broadened its scope. It grew legs as beliefs arose that administrators should not partake in forming policy in any way. And the author reinforces his argument by pointing out defining politics too broadly in the context of the dichotomy, it's just not realistic. An administrator cannot have no part of policy making. So therefore, as originally conceptualized, the administrator should strive for political neutrality and not partake in partisan issues, or as it's stated in the text, highly controversial issues that capture party attention. So therefore, a final look at the definitions of politics and policy is necessary. And as we discussed previously, defining politics and policy too broadly or interchangeably will cause confusion. And the overlap will always exist, the author argues, but they are not identical. And the author provided the following references to convey his point. In partisan politics, the stakes are the powers to make decisions, so votes, offices, elected officials, whereas in policy politics, The stakes are the contents of those decisions. And therefore, the author's key point of the article is public administrators cannot and should not be excluded from the kind of politics that's inherent to policymaking, but they can and should be excluded from politics that has a more partisan character. So the conclusion here, which is the practical application of the author's thesis, is to strive to provide conceptual clarification and correction of the dichotomy. So in order to keep administration politically neutral, it must first be distinguished conceptually and then also be distanced practically from partisan politics. The sense of the dichotomy, the author argues, is that administrators must be kept from the hurry and strife of partisan politics, and we should strive for short-term tenure of elected officials, so the public can frequently reevaluate and choose the best candidate, and long-term servants, public administrators, who can develop skills and experience over time for the greater good of the constituents. And this is the point the author argues that should be rehabilitated. Team, that's all I had. Thank you very much for joining me today, and I hope you have a good rest of the day. Thank you.